I never fucked anybody over in my life. Didn't have it coming. You got that? All I have in this world is my balls and my word. And I don't break them for no one. You understand?
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
I work for Kaiser Soze.
Tu me déçois énormément.
I work for Kaiser Soze.
Je suis colère, les enfants, je suis colère.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Admit One, your movie ticket. I will be your host, Jim. So, as with all new entries in a franchise, I always like to go back and into the previous entries and just kind of catch myself up, so I know what's going on, especially if it's been years since the last one came out. I imagine most of you do the same as well. Certain theater chains have even started doing that. I went to the Dark Knight one, which we'll talk about in another podcast, but today we're focusing on Captain America Civil War. And Civil War is interesting because it marks a new phase, if you will, for Marvel movies. And I'm not talking about phase 1, 2, 3, whatever. I'm talking about the inclusion of more and more of their superhero counterparts. So with the inclusion of Iron Man into the fold on this one, I wasn't exactly sure how far I would need to go back. So initially, I only watched both Caps. Captain America, the first Avenger, and Captain America, the Winter Soldier. And of course, both Avengers. But after seeing Civil War the first time, it becomes clear that Iron Man is important to this. Like, he's a linchpin in this big time. So it's probably important to note at this time that I'll be diving into some pretty spoilery territory here. So if you haven't seen it, I would suggest pausing this right now and go out and watching it until you have, and then come back and join us. Are you back? Good. So with all of that, let's wind the clocks back to 2008. 2008 was a big year for superhero movies, I think, obviously, because The Dark Knight came out and really changed the face of superhero movies. But when Iron Man came out, it did its own face changing, if you will. Is that even a term? I don't know. Who cares? I'm making it one. Marvel took a huge gamble when they borrowed some $500 million or so to start their own studio, to make their own, as still unprecedented, shared universe. It's actually an unprecedented move in my eyes as well. For a comics company at that time, they weren't owned by Disney, obviously, to start their own movie studio. And it's something that DC has yet to learn. I still have hope, but let's not digress right now. So once all the funding was secured, they kicked off said universe with Iron Man. It was even more of a gamble if you consider that they technically didn't have a script during shooting, which I've done before. I wouldn't consider myself a filmmaker, but I have made several of my own movies, and a lot of them didn't involve scripts. So I know how difficult that can be, especially if you're playing with $140 million and the future of your business is at stake. Had it not been for the magical combination of Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr., the MCU probably would have ended with The Incredible Hulk, which in my opinion isn't as bad as everyone makes it out to be, but that's a separate conversation. It didn't hurt that Iron Man was a fresh take on the superhero movie. It broke a lot of rules in my eyes. The hero was a little bit older than we're typically used to. He was a womanizer, he's cocky, and spoiler alert, he doesn't keep his identity secret at the end of the movie. He's also kind of a bit of a jackass at the outset. He has a genuine arc that, like I said, he begins the movie as an asshole, really. And ends with him taking a pretty selfless move at the end there, not caring if that arc reactor exploding is going to kill him as well. He needed to stop Obadiah, and he really didn't care, obviously. And of course, it ends with him, proclaiming that he is Iron Man. So to me, that was a direct reference to Civil War itself, the comic book, which led me to believe that a Civil War event was coming in the MCU. but we'll talk about what I thought about that in just a minute. But with the success of Iron Man 2 was rushed out of the gate a little bit less than 2 years later. It was met with a bit of a tepid response. I admit that I was a little bit let down at first. It was one of those where the marketing material, it looks kick-ass, the trailers are badass. I had a desktop wallpaper on my computer for the longest time. And then when I saw it, I admit that I was a little bit underwhelmed by it. I have since changed my opinion on it, and I firmly believe that it is one of the better Marvel entries. I think it rubs people the wrong way because it doesn't follow that traditional 3-act superhero movie. There's not a beginning action scene, a middle action scene. It's really all character, if you will, and kind of setting up the Avengers, so it maybe does a little bit of service to that more than it does the movie. But that final action scene really pays off. It's exciting watching Iron Man fly around that the Stark Expo and saving all those people. It's intense. Did they bungle what could have been a powerful storyline of Tony dealing with his palladium poisoning? Sure. As most of you may know, in the comic books, Tony struggles with alcoholism. That's kind of a heavy subject to deal with in the MCU, which is a little bit lighter hearted, so the palladium could have taken the place of that. But it is what it is, you know what I mean? It's there. It's still a pretty good movie. It still has that charm, I guess, if you will, of Robert Downey Jr. One of my favorite scenes is when he picks up the strawberries on the side of the road, and he brings them to Pepper, and she's allergic to strawberries, and he just dumps them in the trash can and completely misses. That's one of my favorite scenes in the movie. It wasn't until Iron Man 3, which was released after the Avengers, that the franchise within a franchise, if you think about it, was course corrected in most people's eyes. I personally like Iron Man 2 better than Iron Man 3, but it is what it is. It's not like it's a huge difference, like say Spider-Man 2 to Spider-Man 3. It's not a huge gap there. It can get tiresome watching Iron Man battle similarly equipped baddies, but at the same time, what's the point of a robot suit if you're fighting a regular Joe? You know what I mean? And that's what people say the problem with the MCU is anyway. The bad guys are just weaker opposites of the good guy, which I get. But again, like, if you think about the first Superman with Christopher Reeves, he's fighting a Lex Luthor, a badly wigged Gene Hackman. And it wasn't really until Superman 2 that he fights someone of equal power. So it's kind of boring when someone that powerful fights, like I said, a regular Joe. Yes, in Iron Man 3, Guy Pearce's character was the quote-unquote Mandarin, if you will. And he did have powers. Obviously, he almost killed Tony, so I don't have a problem with that there. As long as they're equally matched, who cares? Like, if they're wearing a robot suit and if it's exciting and it makes sense and it's fun and it's cool to watch, then what difference does it make? Can they have a better arc? Yeah, sure. But those movies are still fun to watch. You know, there are ways to go against that trend, but if you're not careful, you can end up with something like Hulk with Eric Bana, where a good majority of the movie he's just fighting himself, which isn't a problem in and of itself because the Hulk is fighting himself. It's Bruce versus Hulk, you know what I mean? But you just end up cramming these weird villains in there. You know, Nick Nolte's whatever he ended up being in that movie, I'm not really sure. I don't mind the Hulk. I thought it was a great experiment, if you will. But we can talk about that later. So Iron Man 3 kind of tackles those criticisms a little bit. It wasn't until really Civil War, which we'll get to, that they really usurped that. But I really wish Tony would have spent a little more time in his suit, even if you're not going to put it on a bad guy. I also wish they would have spent more time with the PTSD issue. That could have been a great storyline and really elevated this movie to beyond what it is. It's still fun to watch, but again, I think it suffers some of the same issues as Iron Man 2. Some people took issue with the Mandarin switcheroo, which I don't mind per se because I wasn't too familiar with the Iron Man character until these movies. I can see why people get upset with it. My issue was Ben Kingsley did such a great job with his version of the Mandarin. I was kind of bummed to see him turn into Trevor Slattery, that goofy English guy. I would have loved to see his terrorist actually fleshed out and a real terrorist. They did that Marvel one-shot where it kind of redeemed that a little bit, where it showed he was a little bit of an actual terrorist, but are those considered canon? I guess so, but no one's ever going to follow through with it. Personally, I would have ditched that switch in favor of a little more story. Like I said, Tony dealing with that PTSD or whatever they needed to do. One of my favorite things is the look of the new suits. I love that. I believe it's Mark 43, the automated one that he flies around in most of the time. I like that new look. I really wish they could have stuck with that a little bit more. When we go into Avengers: Age of Ultron, like, there's already a new suit, so we really don't get to relish in this new design. They're a little bit more bulky and kind of look more muscle bound, if you will. I really liked that look and the way the Iron Patriot looked. Could have been cool to bring that back a little bit more. And if you ask me, Shane Black was a perfect choice for Iron Man. I love Favreau, and I love Iron Man. I love Iron Man 2. I like Iron Man 3. But if they had brought in Shane Black from the beginning, imagine how great those movies would have been. Iron Man 1 already is, one of the best reviewed superhero movies, so imagine if Shane had come in from the beginning with his whip crack humor and RDJ right there to begin with. I wonder if it would have propelled it into a little bit more of the stratosphere. If they do end up, doing more Iron Mans, which I think Robert Downey Jr. is going to do for the rest of his life. I think he's looking to outdo Hugh Jackman in terms of Wolverine. I would like to see Shane Black come back, and I'm sure most of you would too. At the very least, to write it, maybe not direct it, but his writing chops are top-notch. So my intent on going back through the Iron Mans was to look for clues on Tony's parents, because like I said, the first time I watched this, I didn't watch the Iron Mans. So the first time diving into Civil War, there's all these clues about Tony's parents, and I couldn't remember any of it. So I didn't have the greatest time watching Civil War the first time because I felt like I was in the dark a little bit. I know the Iron Man's back and forwards, but like I said, I couldn't remember anything about his parental units. It wasn't until Winter Soldier that we're actually given any clues to what happened to his parents. There isn't exactly a through line with his dad. He's mentioned here and there. He shows up in Captain America: The First Avenger. But Mom really isn't mentioned at all. There's definitely some unanswered questions there. I like their retconning of it a little bit. The end game for these standalone movies has always been the Avengers. And you can't fill a team with just Iron Man and the Hulk. And next in line were Thor and, of course, Captain America. Captain America had me most nervous in terms of how he would look. Out of all of these characters that they're doing, because they're essentially B-list characters. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but they're not as well known as, with the exception of Captain America, they're not as well known as Spider-Man and the X-Men, things like that. In the comics, Captain America's suit works because it's two-dimensional and it is what it is. It's the comic book world, but in these comic book movies nowadays, you can't just slap a latex or you can't slap a spandex suit on them, So it has to be very practical and very real world. So I was most nervous about what his costume was going to look like. It would have been very easy to make him look goofy, much like his USO costume when he's trying to raise money, when you can put a bullet in the gun of your best guy. They managed to maintain his spangly look while at the same time making his costume practical. I would have ditched the helmet, I think, which he does towards the end of the movie. It can look a little bit goofy, I think, but in the more recent iterations, it's looked a little bit better, in my opinion. Joss Whedon messed that up a little bit in the first Avengers. I thought that that costume was goofy as hell. I know that he had told everyone, and I remember reading in an article in Entertainment Weekly, I believe it was, before the Avengers came out, that yeah, the costume may look goofy on paper, but once you see it in the movie, it makes sense. And again, once he takes that helmet off, it does look a lot better, but it borderlines that spandex suit look, and I'm glad they got rid of that. You know, when you're watching these Marvel movies, it's always fun to watch the Avengers, but in terms of importance to Civil War, the first Captain America, the first Avenger, doesn't hold much weight. If you know the basics of Cap's story and know that him and Bucky are best friends, you're all set. I don't suggest skipping it by any means because it's still a great movie. Joe Johnston did an excellent job on there. But it's almost a product of its time, if you will. And I don't mean that as it was produced and released in 2011. I mean that as it's very World War II-y. It's not a knock against it by any means, but some of the things that happen in this movie are a little bit ridiculous, if for lack of a better word. These larger-than-life tanks, the moves that Cap can do is a little bit removed from where it goes to in the Winter Soldier and Civil War, and even in the Avengers. It's just a little bit of a different character. I still love that movie immensely, but it almost doesn't feel like it's part of the Captain America trilogy, if you will. And we all know that Iron Man kicked ass. The Hulk, we all know how people feel about the Hulk. Like I said, I still love that, but we'll talk about that later. And Iron Man 2 were met with tepid response. So when Thor came out and Captain America, there was a lot riding on it, I think. They were the first, almost like its own phase, if you will. Like Iron Man, the Hulk, and Iron Man 2 were almost like its own phase to me. You know, we were used to Robert Downey Jr. We fell in love with him, and then we got another Iron Man 2 right away. And I don't remember who said it, but, you know, in Iron Man 2, it's almost like Marvel's dealing with growing pains, if you will, so it didn't quite know how to handle it. That's a different argument. It's above my knowledge level, I guess. So when Thor came out and Captain America, I've never seen these characters before. I've seen the Hulk before, obviously, with Eric Bana's version and Lou Ferrigno's version, which I watched all the time. But these were my first foray into heroes I'd never seen before. I love Thor. It's actually, I think, my favorite Marvel movie. So when we talk about Thor, we can talk about that. And Captain America, never seen him before. So I was pleasantly surprised when Captain America was released. It's a fun movie. It's very action packed, and Joe Johnston, like I said, did a great job with it. The Winter Soldier is really where it starts getting important in terms of how it relates to Civil War, and even in the MCU as a whole. It's also the best of the three, in my opinion. If you're looking at the Captain America trilogy, it lays a lot of the groundwork for all that's to come, and not just in Captain America, the MCU itself. The point you really need to pay attention to is when Cap and Black Widow enter the bunker where Zola is located. It's a very fleeting moment, but when he's talking to Captain America, Zola shows an image of, I guess, the murder report or whatever of Howard Stark. So that's like your first clue that the Winter Soldier may have had something to do with it. Like I said, you have to be paying attention to it, and it required me to go back and look at it, and it was only because someone pointed it out to me that I did do that. There's also mention of Stephen Strange in this too, when they have that guy on the top of the building there when we first see Falcon. So I'm wondering how or if Doctor Strange will play into this at all. And what I like about both of the Cap sequels really is they're sequels that I would write. I'm always a big fan of continuing stories and ones that make sense, not just, in The Dark Knight they have the Scarecrow as kind of like cameos. I'm not talking about stuff like that. I'm talking about, Bucky falls off the train and you think he's gone, but then all of a sudden in this he's the main villain. That's one of my favorite aspects of this. Someone that comes back. Zola's there again. Even though it's set 70 years later, it continues that story. And all the characters that were alive at the end of the first one, which isn't many, pop up in this one. What issue I did have with the Winter Soldier was actually the Winter Soldier himself. They build him up and build him up and build him up, but it's almost like the first time we've heard of him. You know, we had Iron Man 3 could have dropped a hint. The Avengers could have dropped a hint that he doesn't need to show up, you know, but maybe like, oh, here's another a hit that the Winter Soldier did. You know, I have to go check it out or something like that. Maybe if Black Widow had said something like that. He's obviously this main character in the MCU that everyone's afraid of. It would have been cooler to see more backstory on him, I guess, is where I'm going. For a movie with his name in the title, you don't see much of him or hear much about him, for that matter, you know. The opening scene of Civil War would have been probably a little bit better suited for this one, even if it didn't make sense. It would, that way when we see Civil War, we're like, oh shit, you know, that's how it plays into it. Everyone kept calling it like a spy movie, if you will, which is cool because usually a superhero movie is a superhero movie. It's almost its own genre, I guess. You may be saying, well, duh, but what I mean is, The Dark Knight was called a detective movie with a guy in a bat suit. Well, he's the world's greatest detective. Of course, it's going to be. So, why wouldn't you take influence from detective movies or cop movies or things like that? It doesn't need to be a science fiction-y thing unless your character is science fiction based, like Guardians of the Galaxy. So, obviously, a spy movie is an accurate representation of this because they are clandestine agents going around taking out hits. Turns out being frozen for years and then unfrozen and brainwashed and things like that, kind of like the Manchurian Candidate, which Tony calls him later. I don't know what you'd call Civil War, but I thought the spy movie moniker fit the Winter Soldier very well. It's also, even though they're continuing stories and things like that, it's also self-contained. You don't really need to see the Winter Soldier to understand what's going on in Civil War. They do that good job of pretending like this movie is the first time someone's seen this movie, whether it's the 11th installment or the 3rd. You could pop in Winter Soldier and know what's going on. It's not like you're watching the Captain America version of The Lord of the Rings where it just kind of cuts out and you have no idea what the hell is going on. They're self-contained. And that goes for the Avengers as well. When you're doing an MCU rewatch for individual movies or you're just watching all of them or whatever, it's probably always important to pop in the Avengers too. TOO. But they're not particularly important to Civil War, for example, here. Iron Man 3, sure, it's important because Tony's dealing with PTSD directly related to what he did at the end of the Avengers. This more so, like when we watch the next Avengers, is probably going to be more important than watching Avengers before this. It directly ties into what's going on in the future. But the Avengers are mostly their own self-contained trilogy. There's not a whole lot of character development, I guess. It's more story-driven, which is fine. That's not a knock by any means. We all know that Age of Ultron was a little bit underwhelming, but they're still fun and good movies to watch. I don't think in this case, though, you know, if you were going back and doing a Captain America rewatch, you'd need to watch the Avengers. So now it's time to tackle the centerpiece of this podcast, Captain America Civil War. So let me read you a little excerpt from my review of Captain America Civil War, which you can actually read on constantlycalibrating.com. The time has finally come when we get to see our favorite heroes do battle with more of our favorite heroes. Again, this time I guess we just get a lot more of them. Captain America Civil War is, of course, the sequel to The Winter Soldier, and is in many ways the culmination of the entire MCU up to this point. Most of the Captain America storylines are reconciled, as well as some of the bigger issues affecting the universe as a whole, at least on Earth. Before Civil War was ever announced, I assumed that it would be an Avengers event and a major event in the MCU. So I was a bit surprised when a major event like this was being played as a solo movie. And now having seen the movie, I was even more surprised. Again, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, we're going to go into spoiler territory here. So when the Winter Soldier was announced and the Russo brothers were set to direct, I was a bit leery. mostly because they were known for their TV work. Yes, they had a few movies under their belt. Welcome to Collinwood happens to be one of my favorites, and I didn't know until just maybe a few months ago. Like, I connected the dots. I was like, holy shit, those are the same people. But I was concerned that they would have trouble grasping the action points of the movie because of their comedy backgrounds. Of course, my fears were put to rest when The Winter Soldier was released, and with that, Captain America suddenly became my favorite Marvel franchise. Not movie, though. Remember I said that was Thor? My favorite sequels are the ones that carry ideas and characters from the first and build upon that, like I mentioned earlier. Winter Soldier obviously did that with Bucky, and Civil War continues to do that, most notably, albeit short-lived, with Crossbones. In Civil War, the Russo brothers continue their reign of the MCU and will no doubt deliver a spectacular pair of Infinity War films, or whatever they're called at that point. We know now that the first one is going to be called Avengers Infinity War. What the second one will be called is beyond me. Civil War seems to have the same problems as the first Avengers, though, as it takes a little bit of time to find its footing. This doesn't mean that the movie is bad for those first few scenes or so. There's just a lot of exposition before the first payoff, and some of it seems like a little bit redundant. I was honestly more preoccupied with trying to figure out what was actually going on than actually sitting back and taking it all in. Civil War is an extremely densely packed movie, and there are so many storylines going on that if you blink, you may miss something. This isn't a bad thing again, because they are fully fleshed out and are all integral to the main plot in some form or fashion. As was teased in the 2 trailers leading up to the release, 2 new characters are introduced to the MCU, Black Panther and Spider-Man. Both are done in such a way that we learn who these characters are and what their motivations are without cramming 2 origin stories into an already packed-to-the-gills movie. Even though they never call it a war, my only concern is a grown man recruiting a high school student to fight in said unnamed war. I have the same problem with Batman recruiting Robins. Having said all that, both characters are great and kick their fair share of ass. I was excited for Black Panther since the first image of him surfaced, and Civil War only made me more excited. So 2018 can't get here fast enough on that one. What I found most interesting about Civil War, as opposed to this year's other superhero brawl, we all know who we're talking about here, was that there was no clear villain mentioned in the trailers. It was just straight friend against friend with no promise of a makeup session. One of Marvel's problems, which we talked about earlier, which I don't particularly take issue with, is their quote-unquote weak villains, meaning they tend to be demented opposites of the main hero. This isn't the case with Helmut Zemo. In fact, the heroes don't actually engage in direct battle with him, but he is the one pulling the strings of their infighting, kind of like what Loki was doing in the Avengers, but with greater and more effective degree. Is this the future of Marvel movies, though? They seem to have shifted their movies to feature more of their other heroes, kind of like Civil War here, and even Hulk showing up in Thor, even though it seems to be so far that his time is going to be limited in that movie. And it's their appearances are more substantial than the ones of the cameo scene in like the Incredible Hulk with Tony, or Captain America in Thor: The Dark World. I used to want to see more of that. When I first heard of the MCU, I thought that that's what they were going to do. Tony would show up real quick in a Hulk fight against Abomination or something like that. Just a hey, I'm helping you out real quick and then I'm out of here type deal. But now it seems they're kind of teaming them up more and more, with Iron Man showing up in Spider-Man now. I used to want to see more of that. And I'm sure Civil War takes things to infinity. But I can't help but wonder if it will start to take away from the solo stories. I guess Thor Ragnarok will have to be our first glimpse into that world to see if that actually is the case. This it probably won't affect the quality by any means, and there'll still be fun movies and stuff, but I'm wondering if, like Civil War, if it wouldn't have been better suited as an Avengers movie. I enjoyed this movie way more the second time around. Like I said in my review, I wasn't really paying attention the first time. I was like trying to keep track of all the stories and what I missed, and trying to keep everything straight. But once I went in the second time, I really knew what was going on, and I could just sit back and relax and take it all in. Because honestly, I was disappointed the first time. Everyone was, it's got like a 90-something% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Not that should affect my opinion or anything, but a lot of people were saying it's one of the best superhero movies ever. I still like it a lot. I like Winter Soldier better, but I definitely enjoyed it more the second time around. I guess I was expecting something different the first time, so maybe I was a little let down. I've heard people claim that there are no stakes because none of the heroes died. I don't think you need stakes because someone dies. I think that's erroneous. It's erroneous on all counts. There can be other stakes rather than life and death. The emotional stakes in this are sky high. During their final battle, Tony even says to Cap, "He killed my mother." And we all know Tony wasn't screwing around at that point, so I'd say that the stakes are pretty high. Even if you may know no one is going to die, it's also an important line because he doesn't say my parents or my mom and dad, it's my mom. And how are the stakes not high when Rhodey is blasted out of the sky and is severely paralyzed? I think it's a little ironic that Tony is pissed since Vision's attack was intended for Falcon, and Falcon would have ended up the same way if he had gotten hit. And it's also weird because Tony has experienced similar falls, but I'm no expert, and I'm not here to rip down the walls of the suspension of disbelief. It adds to the story, of course, because Tony is now even more pissed off. He gets over it for a little bit, obviously, but I would understandably be the same way. It's not like his emotions don't make sense, but what would have happened if Falcon had felt like that? You know what I mean? What's interesting about Civil War is I can see arguments from both sides. It's obviously different than the comic book source material, as opposed to people exposing their identities. Now it makes a little more sense. Like the government wants them acting under a team, which they tried to do with S.H.I.E.L.D., which is interesting because Cap doesn't want to work for the government, but then he used to. So I guess people's opinions can change based on circumstances. Obviously, the Winter Soldier would make me question, what good the government can do in a situation like that, if it can be corrupted so easily. But maybe I need to watch it again, but I don't feel that that aspect of it was properly explored. I can agree, like I said, with both sides. It would have been nice to see Tony struggle a little bit more with the news that, they were the cause of that kid's death, other than just, yep, this is what we need to do. That would have been a cool moment. But what I can agree with is Wanda losing her accent. Yeah, it was kind of a little off-putting in Avengers Age of Ultron. It didn't feel natural to me. I'm not an expert on Russian area accents, but it was a little bit off-putting. And then just to lose it in this is weird. And I can't agree with Cap keeping secrets from Tony. Again, back to Winter Soldier. He was mad at Fury for keeping secrets from him, and now he's doing it from Tony. Not that maybe it was his place to tell Tony about Bucky killing his parents, but it's probably important, you know what I mean? Like I mentioned earlier, and as you know, this movie is jam-packed with heroes. I always envisioned Civil War being an Avengers event. And like I said in my review, it was kind of weird to me that it was a solo movie, which tells me we're in no idea how big Infinity War is going to be if a major event like this is a Captain America movie. There was even a joke going around, dubbing it Avengers 2.5 because there was so many people in it, and it really does feel like it. So I wonder if they just shouldn't have made it that, but it is what it is. I mentioned the Russo brothers earlier as being a driving force behind this and completely on board for what they're going to do for Infinity War, but that credit belongs to the writers as well. McFeely and Marcus, I believe, they were there from the beginning. They wrote the first Avenger, they wrote Winter Soldier, they wrote Civil War. They are writing Infinity War. I believe they wrote part of Thor too. So I would give them all the writing duties to any of the future Marvel movies that they want to focus on. And it just, like, when you have someone like the same writer come in for these trilogy type movies, you can do, they know what they wrote in the first one. They know what they were feeling when they wrote the first one, what these characters were thinking, what was in their headspace when they were writing what the characters were thinking. And you can tell it because when Cap is fighting Tony, he gets up after he's had his face smashed in, pretty much, and he says, "I can do this all day," which is a throwback to the first Captain America when he's being beat up by that first bully in the alley behind the movie theater. And it's also interesting to note, too, we didn't really talk about him too much, but Helmut Zemo, he gets what he wants in this movie. It's interesting. He's a villain that actually completes his task, most of it, because he doesn't get to blow his head off thanks to Black Panther, but his main mission, tearing the Avengers apart, worked. Loki couldn't do that. In fact, it did the opposite. It brought them together. It tore them apart, and the future of the MCU, obviously, their intention was to leave it up in the air. We don't know where these characters are now, what they're feeling, how they're going to get back together. It leaves you with an uneasy feeling. It still had somewhat of a happy ending, if you will, even if their friends aren't friends anymore. It's not as a dark and gutless feeling that the Dark Knight left you with, but we shall see. So that wraps up the first episode of Admit 1. I hope you enjoyed listening to me talk, and I hope I got you through your commute or jog or whatever you happen to be doing. Tune in next time, I hope. Just remember to follow the show on Twitter, Admit1 Podcast. You can follow me personally, Red6 with 2 X's. And, of course, the show is available every other Tuesday on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and, of course, right here on ConstantlyCalibrating.com. Until next time, that's a wrap.
Are you the police?
No, man. We're musicians. I work for Kaiser Soze. I work for Kaiser Soze.
Here's the fucking money!